Ombudsman's office, the types of complaints that they can consider, and when it may be appropriate to contact them after the IPAS complaints process has been completed. So you'll have an opportunity to put your questions in the Q&A section today. So I suppose today's webinar is it's not about encouraging people to complain. It's about helping people to understand the process, and to communicate effectively and to know what to do if they have a concern that isn't resolved. Many issues can be sorted out through respectful conversation. And today we will look at how to have those conversations, when to escalate concerns, and later we'll hear from the Office of the Ombudsman about their role. So why are we here today? Living in IPAS accommodation can be really challenging. It's often shared with other people. There's a lot of waiting for people. People are waiting for important decisions that are going to affect their future. This can cause stress, anxiety, and frustration. And at the same time, staff and managers are working within policies and procedures that they don't always have control of either. So this webinar is really about helping everyone to communicate more effectively so that concerns can be addressed in the right way. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will feel more confident addressing issues and understanding what your options are. So living in IPAS, I suppose an IPAS environment isn't a normal environment for anybody to live in. You're sharing accommodation with people that you've never met before. There are different cultures, different languages, different routines, different expectations. Then you could throw in the house rules on top of that, communal living, shared spaces, and often very, very little privacy. Many people are coping with trauma, uncertainty, missing family, and worrying about what comes next. So it's entirely understandable to feel upset and overwhelmed and frustrated. But I suppose the important question is what you do with that frustration. Then we look at the managers and staff side of the house. So managers are usually the first people that residents get to speak with when there's a problem. And most managers generally want to help, but they also have responsibilities. They have to follow IPAS policies, they have to manage resources, and sometimes they have to make decisions that are out of their control. So an example of this would be someone might want to move rooms and the manager may understand that they want the move, but they can't facilitate the move. So sometimes the answer isn't no because I don't care. It's no because I don't have the ability to change this. And I think understanding that difference helps more productive conversations going forward. So I think implementing techniques that assist effective communication is a really good option for people who want to bring concerns to management and staff. And one of those methods is called the CALM method. So clarify. So be really clear about what's happened and how it's affected you, and what outcome are you hoping for. And ask respectfully. So explain your concern calmly and respectfully and focus on the issue rather than blame, and be clear about what you need. So actually listen to what's being said so you can give the other person an opportunity to respond, and listen carefully and ask questions if something feels unclear or you don't understand what's being said. And then agree on the next steps if the issue cannot be resolved. Agree on moving forward and what that's going to look like. And there's a couple of questions that I think can really help clarify situations where there's uncertainty or there is conflict, that you can ask to make the process a bit clearer. So one of the questions could be, could you help me understand why this decision was made? So if you're requesting something and you get a refusal, find out why the decision was made so that you have an understanding of the process that led to that decision, rather than just assuming that it was made without considering all of the things that need to be considered for your request. Explain the process to me. So again, giving you a better understanding of how those decisions are made. Is there anything that can be done to help. Uh, what are my options? That's a really good one. So it may not be able to resolve the situation that you're dealing with there and then, but are there other options? Is there a point in looking in other directions? Can something else assist? Who should I speak to if this can't be resolved? So is there another staff member? Is there someone more senior that I can have a conversation with? Can we agree on next steps? It's always good to have next steps because it maps out the road. It gives you more control in what's going to happen going next and going forward. So you have a clear understanding of what's going to happen next. When can I expect an update? That's a really useful question because it puts a timeline on it. So will I hear something in 3 days? Will I hear it in 10 days? Another one is, can you explain why my request cannot be approved? So sometimes we assume something wasn't approved, but the actual reality on the ground is it could be something different. So it's always good to clarify why a request cannot be approved. Is there another solution we could consider? Again, opening a dialogue, is there another option for me? And can I have this decision explained to me in writing? And this is really useful because this is something that you can refer back to. This is something that you can keep for your records. So it's always good to have everything in written correspondence for your own records. So the complaints pathway, if we look at it just through this image, you can see that the first option is always to speak with centre manager, talk to your manager about the concern, explain how it affects you, try to resolve the issue informally. If it's resolved there and then no further action is needed. If it's not resolved and you feel like you want to submit a formal complaint, you can do that. We'll see the sample forms in the slides in a few minutes, but you submit your complaint using the complaint form, which is on the IPAS website, but we have a sample in our webinar, in our slides, just in a few minutes. Include as much detail as possible. This is really important. The centre manager will acknowledge and respond within 10 working days. If that's not resolved, then you have an opportunity to escalate to IPAS. You submit your complaint to the IPAS customer service team within 20 days of the date of the centre manager's response. You include a copy of your complaint and the response that you received, and IPAS will review your complaint and provide a final decision in writing. So then we move on to if that's not resolved. So I suppose Paul can speak to this a little bit later when he comes on, but some cases can be and will be independently assessed and reviewed by the Ombudsman. Some cases may not require an ombudsman investigation or assessment. And in those situations, I think it's really important to look at advocacy and who can support you. If you're still unhappy with those decisions, you can reach out to advocacy services. You have different services that may support you and look through your case. So even if it's not suitable for an ombudsman assessment or investigation, there are other options to support you through that. So these are the sample forms, and again, it just makes everything really clear. So when you're approaching your centre manager, you go through your formal complaint, your resident, the name, the centre, your name, your ID, and that could be your blue card, your temporary residence card, or your IRP card. You put your ID in, you detail the complaint, and then you answer the question, sign, date, and then send it back to the manager. And then very same for IPAS. And those sample forms are great because they actually provide the roadmap of what details are needed. And again, coming back to records, date everything, full names, keep all correspondence, whether that's written or emails. If you have pictures, if you have videos, if that's relevant, keep everything, date and record everything because it is going to assist you in the process further down the line, should you need to take it that far. So here we have an example of a situation where a resident is unable to sleep because their roommate watches videos really loud at night. So the action is the resident approaches the centre manager and explains how the noise is affecting their sleep and can anything be done. So the outcome in this instance was the centre manager spoke with the resident and reminded them of the centre's quiet hours and encouraged them to use headphones. So the issue is resolved and no formal complaint is needed. So the key learning for this is a lot of concerns can be resolved through respectful communication before a formal complaint is necessary. So now we have example number 2, where a formal complaint is warranted. So again, a resident reported damp and mold in their room several times over a number of weeks. Despite raising the issue with the centre manager, they feel the problem has not been resolved. So the action is the resident submits a formal written complaint to the centre manager. When the issue remains unresolved after receiving a response, they follow the IPAS complaints procedure and they escalate their complaints to the IPAS customer service team. So the outcome here is IPAS will review the complaint, they will seek the information from the accommodation provider, and they will consider whether the matter has been managed in line with IPAS house rules and complaints procedures. So again, the key learning here, if a concern cannot be resolved locally, residents have the right to escalate their complaint through the official IPAS complaints process. And this is example number 3. So again, Paul's probably going to speak to this in a little bit more depth in a few minutes, but a resident completed the IPAS complaints process, but remains dissatisfied with their complaint and how it was handled. The action is after receiving the final response from IPAS, the resident contacts the Office of the Ombudsman to request an independent review. The Ombudsman assesses whether the complaint falls within its remit and whether the complaint was handled fairly and in line with their proper procedures. Again, key learning here is the Ombudsman is independent of IPAS and may review complaints after IPAS complaints process has been completed. So another thing that I just wanted to mention, a lot of times when we look at people thinking about making a complaint, they're worried that it might affect their case or that it will be held against them. And it's really important that you understand you absolutely have the right to complain. You absolutely have the right to raise concerns. And that cannot and should not be ever used against you, held against you. And it has nothing to do with and no interference with your international protection claim or application. So yeah, I hope that helped. And if you do require any support or advocacy around submitting complaints, you can log on and email accommodation@doras.org, or we have our phone numbers here and we'll be able to support you through that process. Now, I think Paul is on. Hi, Paul.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. Paul Mallon is my name. I'm an investigator in the Ombudsman's office. I will try and share my presentation now. Oh, I think you need to stop with it. Okay. Can you see that? Yeah. So I'm just here to talk a little bit about the Office of the Ombudsman and our role in complaints in the international protection area. So first slide is just a sort of brief overview of who we are, the type of complaints we deal with, how to complain to us, and then if more importantly, if anybody has any questions at the end, I'll do my best to answer. I see in the chat a lot of people have put sort of their specific issues. I'm not in a position to sort of address individual complaints during the webinar. What I'd suggest, if you take nothing else from today, from my few words, it's contact us if you have a genuine issue with IPAS or your accommodation, and you've made reasonable efforts with IPAS through its complaints process to try and resolve those issues. In terms of the role of organisations like Doras and the Irish Refugee Council and other organisations like that, they provide an invaluable function from our perspective in advocating for people. We're not an advocacy service, so those organisations can help you engage with IPAS or the centre manager in various circumstances. So they are important, I think, in terms of complaints within the area. The current ombudsman is Ger Deering. He's been in office since around 2022. what we do, in very simple terms, we investigate complaints from people who have been unfairly treated by public service providers, including IPAS, but not exclusively IPAS. We deal with pretty much every public service provider, from IPAS, local authorities, government departments, the HSE. So it's not necessary. A lot of people we talk to when we do our visits to centres don't necessarily have complaints about the centre or IPAS. It can be about accessing health services, accessing medical cards, things like that. Applying for public service numbers, etc. In essence, we look at the actions and decisions of those public service providers. So an action or a decision that affects you, or an inaction, something they don't do that affects you. And pretty much every organisation that's publicly funded is within our remit. So it's quite extensive. We are impartial, so it's important to note we don't take sides. We're not an advocacy service. We're here to independently, impartially assess an issue with reference to whatever evidence you provide, whatever evidence the public body provides, and whatever rules or legislation govern that. And we make a call or make a decision following that independent or impartial assessment of investigation of a complaint. We're independent of government. We're not part of the government. We're an independent statutory agency charged with the role of investigating complaints against public services. So I think one of the first lines in our legislation is the Ombudsman shall be independent in the performance of his function. So it is an independent service. We kind of serve as an alternative route to legal action. So for a lot of, there probably is a route for a lot of the sort of issues that people take to us, but it's expensive, and our service is free and not kind of non-adversarial and kind of informal. And ultimately, our goal is to try and raise public standards. Whether it's through individual complaints or thematic or systemic investigations, or investigations of bigger issues that we find from even sort of routine complaints, or stuff that we identify of our own initiative to investigate. As I said, it's an informal service. We aim to deal with complaints as quickly as possible. I don't have the stats, but we do try close a lot of complaints within 3 months. But again, it depends on the complexity of the case. Some obviously more complex cases can take longer, and if necessary, if we can't resolve it informally with the body, a detailed investigation can be carried out. We can identify systemic issues. So even from sort of routine complaints that you might think is just a small issue, that could actually be a bigger problem within that public service provider, or whether it's IPAS or the centre. So we can look at systemic issues, and we have published a number of investigation reports around systemic issues for things like assessment of overpayments, care for under 55s, people in nursing home care under 55, etc. And I suppose another function of the office is to sort of highlight learning. Complaints, they does have a negative connotation, but it's also a learning opportunity for the public service providers. See where maybe they're doing things wrong, or how they can improve their services to the public. Just briefly about the power of the Ombudsman. So we're looking at administrative action. So we're looking at the actions and decisions of public bodies. A decision to transfer for somebody from one centre to another, a decision to refuse a payment, a decision to refuse your application for housing support, things like that. Certain things we can't look at: clinical judgment. So that's the actual clinical decisions of doctors, and academic judgment. So we deal with complaints from third level institutions, which I won't go into in any great detail, but we can't look at things like academic judgment, which is essentially a decision or on a mark, stuff like that. And following an investigation, the Ombudsman can make recommendations. We can't compel a public body to do something. We can make a recommendation. Now generally, our recommendations have been accepted, but it's important that we can't compel that. It's just the restriction of the legislation. We can't compel the public body to do something. If we, but generally, if we feel they've got something wrong and we highlight that with them, they will fix it. And I suppose in terms of the investigation process, we can request any file information or thing as part of the investigation, and we can compel officials to attend before us. And ultimately, if recommendations aren't accepted, we can make a report to the Houses of Parliament or the Oireachtas. In terms of who can and can't complain, you kind of have to demonstrate that you've been unfairly treated because of an administrative action by a public service body. So you have to be, I suppose the third point there, you have to show that you've been adversely affected, and that it's you that has been unfairly treated by a decision or an action or inaction of a public service provider. With consent, somebody can complain on your behalf. So I mentioned at the start about organisations like Doras or the Refugee Council or Cross Care or a number of other organisations that can help you make a complaint. Even the local Citizen Information Centre staff there, the information officers can help with that. In one of the sort of key conditions of making a complaint to us is we're kind of a last resort, so you have to demonstrate that you've made a reasonable, what we call reasonable efforts to try and resolve the matter with the public body. So I know Sue has outlined the sort of stages of the complaints process, which I won't go into in any detail. IPAS's complaints process is available on its website. So, but basically, it's, if when you're dealing with IPAS, you can try and resolve the matter locally first if it is an accommodation or a centre issue. Failing that, complaint to IPAS. And if you're happy with the outcome, you can come to us. For things like transfers, or things like withdrawal of accommodation, there is, for things like transfers, there is, make a complaint to IPAS and come directly to us, because they're generally made by IPAS rather than the centre manager. And with regard to the withdrawal of accommodation, the legislation, the reception regulations do outline an appeal mechanism. So if your reception conditions, as they're known in the Act, are reduced or withdrawn, so invariably that involves, in our experience, the withdrawal of accommodation. There is a right of appeal to the Minister in the first instance, and then to IPAT, the International Protection Appeals Tribunal. That's set out in the legislation, and that kind of ties our hands in that we can't investigate a complaint until such time as those appeals mechanisms are exhausted. But we do have some discretion, and as I said, if you take nothing from today, it's if you think we can help, just give us a call and we can talk you through. I'd say the majority of bypass related complaints that come to our office, I'd see, and we are quite happy to exercise the discretion we have to take a complaint where somebody clearly hasn't raised it with the body, if the circumstances warrant it. But every case is different. So as I said, just give us a call. The other main condition is that you have to make a complaint within 12 months of the issue, or 12 months of becoming aware of it. So if you write to us about a complaint about the centre manager 15 months later, we're probably not going to be able to look at that. So timely, get your complaint in as quickly as possible. If you're to IPAS or the centre manager, if you're unhappy, get to us as quickly as you can, but certainly within 12 months. In terms of the common IPAS complaints, poor communication. So, you make a request for something, you don't get a response, you're ignored. These are types of complaints we deal with. Warning letters, so breaches of the house rules. You may be unhappy with the investigation process or the lack of an investigation process. So, you know, you might have got a warning letter for whatever breach of the house rules, and you might feel you haven't been given an opportunity to dispute that or defend yourself. So, you know, again, you raise your concerns with IPAS, and if you're unhappy with their response or its response, you come to us. Probably the biggest issue at the moment for us is transfer refusals. There's two types of transfers, voluntary and involuntary, that we're looking at the moment. So the voluntary transfers is where somebody is looking for a move to another centre for whatever reason. I know some reasons have been mentioned in the chat, and it's refused. Now, as an organisation, we do accept that IPAS is operating in a very difficult situation in terms of the demand for accommodation, the difficulties it's experiencing sourcing accommodation. However, if you feel if you have issues with the accommodation that's been provided to your family, and you've made reasonable efforts to try and raise this with IPAS and got nowhere, come to us. In terms of the involuntary transfers, it's generally where somebody has status and they get the letter giving them, I think, about 6 weeks to find community-based accommodation or accept an offer of temporary emergency accommodation usually in a rural location, generally in a rural location. Our position is that this isn't unreasonable. However, we have seen a number of cases where a decision to provide temporary emergency accommodation in a rural location isn't reasonable, and we have investigated complaints about IPAS. So generally, it's either on medical grounds. So again, I don't want to comment on individual cases or scenarios. If you're affected by one of these decisions, if you've been issued with the letter giving you 6 weeks to find accommodation in the community or avail of temporary emergency accommodation in another location that you find unsuitable or you feel it's unreasonable, make a complaint to IPAS. And if you're unhappy, make a complaint to IPAS, providing whatever supporting evidence you have, whether it's on medical grounds or whatever. And if you're unhappy with its response, you can come to us. In terms of the sort of voluntary transfers, one of the big issues, I suppose, is medical grounds. So I think at present, the only circumstance in which IPAS will consider a transfer request is on medical grounds. So I think there's a medical priority referral form. It's generally assessed, but not always assessed by IPAS's independent medical referee. So if you're looking for a transfer on medical grounds, have a look at the medical priority transfer policy, and make sure that you're providing strong medical evidence to support your application for a transfer. And again, if you go through that process and you're unhappy with the outcome, you can come to us. Other issues we deal with relate to things like accommodation. So that could be food, facilities like washing facilities, transport, things like that, and the cleanliness or the general suitability of the accommodation. Complaint handling is another issue. So you make a complaint, you're not happy with how they handle a complaint, you don't think you feel you were listened to, you feel they ignored evidence, that they didn't talk to people who maybe witnessed what happened. We can look at that, and that's whether it's IPAS or the centre manager. If it's a centre manager, generally, again, it's about making your complaint to IPAS through its policy first, following that process, and then coming to us afterwards. And the withdrawal of accommodation. So I touched upon that briefly earlier on. So generally, the withdrawal of accommodation is where somebody breaches house rules and a decision is made to amend or withdraw material reception conditions. It's generally amend or revise. I can't remember the specific word in the Act, where they withdraw accommodation. You get an enhanced rate of daily expense allowance. And in those cases, there is that right of appeal to the minister, or right of review to the minister and to IPAS. And as I said, our hands can be tied. But if your circumstances are urgent, I'd certainly contact us. As I said, we do have discretion to accept a complaint where it's evidence somebody hasn't made avail of the complaints process. One of the more, common complaints as well is around complaints about staff members. I think Sue touched upon it earlier on about, being treated respectfully by staff, whether it's IPAS or whether it's in the centre. Equally, there's a responsibility on both residents and staff to treat each other with respect and dignity. And sometimes that doesn't happen, and we get quite a few complaints about the behaviour of staff in centres and the attitude of staff in IPAS towards residents, and we would investigate those. In terms of, I suppose, I mainly talk about what the sort of general issues we deal with, and hopefully more so in an IPAS context, but it's also important to know the stuff that we can't deal with, just to sort of save you a bit of time, more so than anything else. Gardaí, there's a financial services, children. So there is the Office of the Children's Ombudsman, and they have a very similar role to us in relation to complaints, very similar jurisdiction. But they deal with complaints where it's a child or a young adult under the age of 18 has been adversely affected by the actions or inactions of a public service provider. So, for example, the suitability of accommodation for a child with a disability or an illness or some sort of medical condition could be more appropriate to the Office of the Children's Ombudsman, because it's really about how that's impacting the child. But there is a little bit of crossover, because ultimately it's the adult or the parent that makes the request for a transfer or request for a different room or whatever it is. So again, if you're unsure, ring us. Get your complaint into us, and we'll assess it. And as I said, I see the majority of these type of complaints, and we try to deal with them as quickly as we can. Employment or consumer issues. So there is the I can't remember the name, the Labour Relations Commission is called something, at the Equality Tribunals, and there's the Competition and Consumer Protection Authority. Pensions and financial services are the Pension and Financial Services Ombudsman, I think, and immigration and naturalisation. So we're not allowed to look at any issues relating to your application or applications for asylum or visas or family reunification, etc. Touch on that a bit more in the next slide. So applications for asylum or citizenship or family reunification or residency or just general immigration visas, our Act specifically precludes us from looking at those type of issues. So we can't help you with any of those, unfortunately. Generally, it's because there is an alternative route for appeals or complaints, things like IPAS or in a lot of cases, I suppose, the courts. There are other ombudsman's offices, the police ombudsman, so the Gardaí, any complaints about the behaviour of the Gardaí, financial services, pensions ombudsman, the children's ombudsman. So their information is readily and easily available on the internet. In terms of how to complain, I put a QR code in the top. I've sent a copy of the presentation to Sue, so I'm happy for it to be circulated. The QR code links you into our online complaint form. At present, we accept complaints via our online portal. When a complaint is made via the portal, it's generally set up. You'll get an acknowledgement, and then you'll have an email address and a case number. You can send in additional information. I think the portal does allow you add documents as well, which is useful enough. We have an office in Dublin. You can make an appointment to come and talk to us, and we have monthly complaints clinics in Cork, Galway, and Limerick. That information is available on our website. I know Cork, I think, is the first Wednesday of the month. Galway and Limerick might be the last Tuesday or Wednesday of the month. So that information is usually published on our website. The Ombudsman website contains a quite a good bit of information about who we are, what we do, and bit more than I can give at the moment. So just to sort of summarise, you can complain to us pretty much about anything. I know this is very IPAS specific, but it's not always IPAS that's the problem. In my experience, we've dealt with complaints about accessing medical cards, PPSNs, which is usually important, access to GPs, problems with the medical card section, get GPs assigned, problems with the daily expense allowance, problems with housing applications when you have status and you may still be in IPAS accommodation, problems accessing emergency accommodation. So that's kind of an issue at the moment where somebody has status, they've been told to move out or provide or avail of temporary emergency accommodation in a different area. They look for emergency accommodation in their local area where they have a housing application and it's refused. So we can look at those type of issues as well. And before submitting a complaint, you must try and resolve it with the public body first. So as I mentioned, Sue has gone through the IPAS process. But if it is urgent, give us a call or log it. If it's not something we can deal with at that stage, and it's something we feel you may need to raise with IPAS or the centre manager, we will tell you that. Generally, it's to give them an opportunity to fix it before we get involved. But generally, this is you must try and resolve it with the public body, whether it's through their complaints or appeals processes, before we can look at it. And when you write to us, just set out what the complaint is about, how you've been affected, and what you want to achieve. I think those steps are set out if you make a complaint via online. But equally, people write to us as well, and particularly if you're using an advocacy service, just be very clear what your complaint is, how you've been affected, and what you feel needs to be done to sort of bring some sort of resolution to the matter. And that's it, I think. Yeah, that's it. So I think that QR code just is linked to our website, and as I said, the information on a bit more information on what we do is you can find there. And just sort of to finish up, if sorry, I know I sound a bit of a broken record on this, but if you think we can help you, just go make a complaint online or ring the office. Simple as that. We'll be as honest as we can with you, in terms of whether or not we can take the complaint, and hopefully I've kind of outlined some of the difficulties that there are in the area, particularly around transfers and suitability of accommodation. Again, we're trying to acknowledge the difficulties experienced by residents and sort of balance that with the difficulties IPAS has experienced. However, every case is different, so you need to contact us if you feel you've been put out in some way, shape, or form by your interactions with IPAS or the centre manager or any public body. So I'll hand it back to Sue, if that's okay, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Hi, Paul. That was really useful, and I imagine really informative and helpful for people who want to engage in the process but aren't sure, after the IPAS piece, if it hasn't been resolved, is there somewhere else that they can go? And it's great to know that your office is willing to take a look at the cases independently. And I think that's an issue that we see is there is a feeling that not all IPAS or centres are fair, or the decisions aren't fair, and there's the power dynamic, and people aren't feeling heard. So I think it's really useful to have your office there for people to engage with you, and if it's something that you can continue with the process with them, all the better. And I know there's other options for people as well, like community law and mediation. And I know they're a free service, and they're happy to look into other issues, and citizens' advice and Doras and ourselves. So I do think there are options for people who feel like maybe their voice isn't being heard. So thanks so much, Paul, because that's really, really useful. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A that I might just have a look through for now. So So I suppose for today's session and for this webinar, I'm not going to be able to look into individual cases. I can see a couple of them coming through on the chat and in the Q&A, and I'm absolutely happy for people to reach out to us through that accommodation at doras.org email address. But I think just in the interest of time and fairness, we're not going to go into individual cases today. So there's a question here. Why are residents not allowed to use fans in the IPAS accommodation centre? Paul, can you answer that, or do you want me to take it? It's an unusual
Well,
one.
I don't know, but I know from a recent complaint, I've a recent complaint that came across my desk, that there does seem to be an aversion to sort of electrical items are small. I think it might be a health and safety thing. Again, I don't speak for IPAS, I don't know, but again, just in terms of a complaint, if you know the weather has been quite warm the last couple of weeks, if you're in a non-air conditioned building and you know that's your accommodation, you know. It's something you should raise with IPAS, you know, centre manager IPAS, and then if you still feel aggrieved at the end of it, come to us. Like I know it's probably going to be my default answer. You know, use complaint to IPAS or the centre manager, or raise the issue with them and then come to us. But yeah, it might be something that they can resolve. I know there's probably something in the house rules about it. Again, it's not my area of expertise. We haven't heard. I've not seen any complaints about it, but I have seen complaints about people get warning letters for breaching house rules because they've had certain small electrical items in their rooms. So I think it could be a health and safety thing. But again, you'd expect a bit of common sense. You know, hot weather, no air conditioning.
It's a reasonable ask
Yeah, I
given
would think so.
temperatures. Yeah.
Certainly, that's, you know, if that complaint was on my desk, that's the approach I'd be taking with IPAS. And I'd certainly ask them to exercise a bit of reasonableness, a bit of common sense.
I think that's fair. It's reasonable. It's warm, and I think just what we had touched on. I think there's a lot of variables, and I think each manager, each centre is going to have a different style of management, and I think, you know, some people have been moved from one centre to another, and they may have preferred the manager in their other centre or their former centre, and that may be because the manager is a little bit more easygoing, or some managers, you know, so it really is, it's difficult to have, there isn't a consistent standard across the board, and I think that's why it's quite challenging. In that instance, I know some managers would say absolutely you can have a fan. In other instances, those managers might say, you know, it's against the rules. So I think that's why it can be really challenging for people navigating the International Protection Accommodation Service. And again, just coming back to why it's so useful to have the Ombudsman there as an independent who can look at cases like that and, you know, perhaps go back to IPAS and challenge those decisions, you know, based on what's reasonable for people. Or indeed, you know, Doras or any other advocacy service. There is another question. So there's a question here from a person saying, in terms of the withdrawal of IPAS accommodation, is there a specific separate appeals process for this that is different to the formal complaint pathway for general concerns? I think it's the same, is it?
Well,
withdrawal of service complaint to IPAS.
yeah, well, it depends on the reason for withdrawal of accommodation. As I mentioned, if IPAS amend your material reception conditions, in our experience, that generally means they've withdrawn accommodation. So they haven't withdrawn all the various elements that constitute material reception conditions, like access to, you know, food and medical services, stuff like that. It's generally the accommodation. So in our experience, it's generally with the accommodation that's withdrawn because of serious breaches of house rules. And there is a formal review and appeals process there set out in the reception regulations. If you have status and IPAS write to you to say, I think usually it can be between 6 and 9 months. There's a name for the letter, I can't just think of it at the moment, where they'll say you have 6 weeks. I think it's roughly about 6 weeks they give you to find community accommodation, suitable accommodation in the community, or if you can't, they'll provide you with temporary emergency accommodation, and they'll give a specific location. Those decisions, you just email, I think it's the IPAS inbox at justice.ie, saying, I'm not happy with this decision. Could you consider keeping me in Dublin? And outline the reason. So I've recently looked at a complaint about this. It's still in its early stages, but the gentleman or lady has significant medical circumstances, and they require access to specific hospitals in the Dublin region. So that makes sense. And I know from previous cases that they'll IPAS have been reasonable, and they will allow or will provide emergency accommodation in an area to allow a person access medical facilities where that's required. So, but again, like every case is different, and I think the threshold for in terms of what your medical circumstances are is quite high. If there are hospitals in other parts of the country, and that'll be IPAS's argument. You've got this condition, that can be treated in this other hospital, or you're only attending appointments every 6 months. It's you can come down from these are the type of arguments we get from IPAS. So just bear that in mind when you're the key thing is when you're requesting something on medical ground, provide the strongest medical evidence you have to clearly state why you need to be in a particular area. That's important as well. Not just that you have a medical condition, but this is why you need to be in that particular area. So hopefully that explains it. So if it's a formal decision under the reception regulations, they write to you and they'll explain your appeals mechanisms. I think they generally amend your material reception conditions, and that, as I said, involves the withdrawal of accommodation, usually because of serious breach of house rules and behaviour. And there is a formal appeal process set out. But if it's status and you have been given notice to move out, there is no legal obligation on IPAS to provide accommodation to somebody who has status. So they will generally offer temporary emergency accommodation, and I've seen in the letters they sent that they link you in with a support worker in some housing organisation to try and source accommodation. But as we all know, sourcing accommodation is extremely difficult in most parts of the country, particularly in the bigger cities. So it is a big issue at the moment. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it's very clear. We have a question in the chat, and I know it's something that we've seen quite a bit. Are IPAS residents automatically offered a homeless assessment to access homeless services, or is this something that they have to organise themselves? Do you want to answer that, or do you want me to take this one?
Well, I can answer it in that I don't know. Homeless assessment.
So I think what this is if you leave IPAS accommodation or choose not to take your transfer, will you be assessed for homeless services? And I can kind of speak to what I've seen with our local authority here is that they will say, if you're still in IPAS accommodation or have you been offered something, that they won't assess you for homeless services.
Yeah, I think that's our experience as well. But again, it's not my area. We have I'm part of the international protection team. We have a housing team that we link into with on these issues. So if you've, for example, living in Limerick, in a centre in Limerick, you've been told you need to move out in 6 weeks, and you've been offered alternative accommodation in Rosslare or Cahersveen or Buncrana, whatever, and you've a job and your family's settled in that area. We have seen cases where local authorities will refuse to provide emergency homeless accommodation because you have access to accommodation in another area. I've not dealt with
That's
those
what we get
cases,
told. Yes.
and I can't speak for my colleagues, but I don't think that's reasonable. And certainly they're the type of cases that we would look at. So the first stage is generally, if you refuse, you should have a right of appeal. And the local authorities aren't always the best in terms of having appeals processes, so they will have a complaints process. So if you have a homeless assessment in a particular local authority area, it's refused for that reason, make a complaint. All of them have customer service, customer charters, complaint process, I think. And if you're unhappy with the outcome, come to us. If it's urgent, come to us after the refusal, and I can, if I see it, it probably won't come to my desk, but I'll after this, I'll talk to my colleagues in the housing team, because I think it is an issue, and it's an issue they're aware of. I just don't know what work they've done in the area. But it is something we're aware of, and is something that we're actively looking at. So definitely, if you find yourself in those circumstances, and have sort of tried to resolve with the council, come to us.
Brilliant. That's really
Actually,
good to
sorry,
know as well, even for
yeah,
ourselves here in Doras. That's
yeah.
really, really useful to know.
Sorry, I am actually dealing with a complaint of that nature at the moment, but it's slightly different in that the individual voluntarily left his accommodation prematurely. He hadn't received a letter. There was some sort of issue with in the centre, and he moved to a different county, and he's experiencing difficulties accessing homeless services in that county now. His application for housing has been approved, I understand. There's a rep on it. There's one of the other organisations is helping with it, and I think because he voluntarily left, or because he voluntarily left, he was marked as absent, and then his accommodation was withdrawn on that basis. So the council, I think, have argued that he had left of his own will. He'd given up accommodation, so they weren't. I think that's the stumbling block in this particular case. But I haven't actually looked at the specifics of the case yet, because the voluntary organisation were still engaged with the council and felt they would probably get a resolution. But it looks like that's failed, and they'll be coming back to me with that type of case. So we do deal with that issue. We are aware of that issue, and I personally think it is a bit unreasonable, because you could be in a centre for 2, 3, 4 years, family in school, working locally, have your housing application in that area. So it does seem to be unfair. So certainly try resolve with the council and come to us, and we'll have a look at it.
Thanks, Paul. We have another question here in the chat around storage of breast milk for small babies. The new rules, it was stated that we are not allowed to use a freezer in our rooms. Can IPAS consider people with babies that we need to preserve our breast milk? So that's I can understand that's a really challenging one. Because
I've had a look at a similar case recently. I think the house rules. Sorry, I'm just trying to bring up the house rules. I think the house rules do say something about that. They certainly talk about temperature control medication and stuff like that. So there might be some scope. Again, it goes back to the fan issue. I think small electrical items, obviously, a small fridge is a small electrical item, but I think it's sort of health and safety and concerns about fires and stuff like that. But I think the house rules do have some exemptions. I'm just trying to scoot through it now. But I did see something like that recently. I just can't remember if it was the case. It was one of my cases, but certainly, see, we have a gentleman who screens. They review every case to see if we can deal with it or not. So I get consulted on a lot of these cases. So I think you reach a point where there's so many complaints coming in. You're trying to differentiate between what one you're looking at. But that issue has been raised recently. And as I understand it, the problem was the residents had been allowed to have fridges, and then they were told they weren't. So Can I come back? I'll just have a look through the house rules. That's okay.
We just got a response actually from Irish Refugee Council saying the updated house rules say exceptions can be made for
Yeah,
baby's milk. So that's just a new update. Thanks so much, Hannah. It's really helpful. It's not a freezer, but it's a fridge policy, I believe.
fridge. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to have a quick scan through again, folks. I'm not going to read out anything that's identifying or any personal case stories, just because um, we just want to keep it fairly general for today. So I am reading them and I am seeing them. I'm not going to be able to read them out today. Okay, so there's another question here. As an asylum seeker, if I haven't been given my status, I am on appeal and I am working. Am I allowed to leave the centre and get my own accommodation due to my work to be closer to my work?
I'm not entirely sure if
I
you
think you
haven't been.
can leave state
Oh, yeah,
accommodation, I think.
yeah, you can, but I think you might lose your. Again, it's not my area of
Payment.
expertise, but I think you might lose your payment. I'm not sure whether you lose other things like medical cards and stuff like that. But if you still have a right to work and you can afford to leave a centre, I assume you can. Again,
Yeah,
it's not my area.
I think,
Maybe somebody from the Refugee Council, if they're on, might know a bit more about that. It's not something I've come across. But I assume you can, yeah. You know,
yeah,
he's still under appeal, so or he or she, they said they can still reside in the
yeah.
country until
And
that's resolved. So
I think because they're working, they're probably financially um yeah, they're financially stable enough to leave. I think if you weren't working and you tried to live in the community independently, you would lose access to your allowance and your medical card, I believe.
yeah, I'm not sure, but and if you yeah, I think there was a sort of follow-up question appeared there or chat about can you ask IPAS to move you closer to where you work? Again, it goes back to the transfer thing. If
Yeah,
generally work, I don't think that's a sufficient
not
reason
anymore. Yeah, I
to,
think
to
once upon a time you could make a case for education, courses, employment,
yeah,
marriage,
yeah,
and now I think that it they've really kind of closed in on, and what I'm seeing and hearing is it has to be exceptional medical.
yeah. The only other moves we've seen recently, we have a few complaints about, again, going back to, I suppose, another type of involuntary transfer is we've had a couple of cases where maybe accommodation for 4 people has been provided and they have another child and IPAS aren't informed of this. And then, but eventually it comes to their attention and they deem that family to be under accommodated. So they'll transfer. They've transferred families from one centre to another on that basis. And but again, it's the reverse problem in that families are settled in that particular area and they're working in that particular area and that they don't want to move to another area. So it's kind of a reverse transfer problem in that they want to move somebody to another area who hasn't sought a transfer because the accommodation isn't suitable. So we've dealt with some of those complaints again. Again, it is difficult because there's an obligation on IPAS to provide a certain standard of accommodation. So you know I think in that the particular case I dealt with, one of the adults moved out and that resolved the issue. So we never got to the bottom of it, but just to be aware that's another scenario. So we've seen a few of these where IPAS have looked to move families because they feel the accommodation isn't sufficient for the family size, and people have been unhappy with that. So there are issues we can look at as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Is there a timeline on when a manager or a centre manager should respond to a complaint? And same for IPAS. I think in the slides, I think the IPAS response has to be within 20 days.
Yeah, I had a look at that. I saw that in the chat. I had a look at the policy. I don't know whether it's, oh yeah, they will respond to you. What happens if you are not happy with how the centre handles your complaint? They will respond to you within 14 days, it says so.
Hmm.
If you are not satisfied with how the centre manager handles your complaint, inform me, you may complain formally in writing to them and they will respond within 40 days. So
Great, thank you.
that's what it says in the policy.
Just looking again in the Q&A section. Again, folks, I am going to try and avoid anything that's personal and any individual cases just for today's session. This is another comment here about fridges, refrigerators in our room. Store our meals in fridges, especially because it makes meal times easier for young infants and children. But obviously, as you said earlier, you can't have the electrical items in the room as it could cause health and safety issues.
Yeah, it does say, sorry, I did find it there a couple of seconds ago. I think it says generally electrical items aren't allowed in the room for safety reasons, but you can seek permission from the centre manager. I'm just looking at the 2025 version of the House rules that I Googled. So unless there's a later version, it does seem to give centre manager scope to allow. So again, it's gone down to being reasonable. If it, like the fan issue in warmer weather, like if you have medication or breast milk, as you said, that needs to be refrigerated, it would make sense. I think I don't know whether I'm looking at the most recent. I think in the version of the House rules I saw, it talks about centres making reasonable efforts to accommodate such requests for providing suitable refrigeration facilities for people who have temperature control medication, etc. And that can involve provision of a small fridge. I think I saw that somewhere, but I can't see it in the current version of the House rules I have. So, just whoever is affected by that, talk to their centre manager. Have a look at his House rules first to talk to the centre manager and see if they can resolve it. If they can't, make a complaint to IPAS and then come to us.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I think a lot of the questions that are coming in now are more individual. So I think we might, if there isn't anything else, just want to double check. Yeah, we just answered that. Yeah, so I think we'll leave it there. And I think, Paul, it's been really useful having you from the Office of the Ombudsman today, because I think sometimes people aren't aware that you're independent, like ourselves. We're not affiliated in any way with IPAS or centre managers. We're both independent. We'll be coming at it, I suppose, Doras will be coming at it from an advocacy perspective. And then, the Office of the Ombudsman would be able to look at it from an independent assessment and review perspective, which, I suppose is just another option for people if they feel they've gotten to the end of the road or they haven't been heard or their case hasn't been resolved. So I think it's been super useful for you to have come on today. I've just a note here to say as well, we will follow up with everybody. We have all your contact details. So I'm conscious that a lot of people have written in with specifics that, again, we won't be able to look at this time on the webinar. But there is an opportunity to follow up with Doras, and we have all of your contact details saved on the register form. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone again for taking the time to listen to Paul and myself. And yeah, just many thanks to Paul for taking the time to come on as the Office of the Ombudsman and talk through what they can assist with for people. And I hope it was useful to people as well.
Yeah, no problem. As I said, just give us a shout if you feel we can help.
Excellent. Take care. Thanks all. Bye bye.
Thanks.